government and individuals who have suffered from a breach. Failure to do so can have some big fines, 1.8 million for organisations and 370,000 for individuals. And some of you have heard this before and some of you may not have, but what we're going to do is look at, does this apply to you? Will you have to do anything right now? And could any failure to act put you out of business? And should you have liability insurance, and would this cover you? So these are some of the questions that we'll be looking at, and some more specific ones on what really should you be doing. Now, you know that ACS has a strong, let me just bring up the slides for a second, one moment. So hopefully in a second you'll be able to see my slides. That's the cover slide. Is that good? Thank you. Now we know that ACS has a strong focus on cybersecurity. We know it's not only a critical topic, but one there's a shortage of well-qualified and experienced staff. Well, as of this morning, I've been upgraded to certified professional cybersecurity, and I certainly would recommend that all our ACS members look into this certification. Now, we know that cybersecurity is important, but how aware are Australian businesses of the legislation that's coming in, and what steps should they take? Well, according to a new survey results that have just been published in the Information Age, the majority, or well over half, are not aware, and hence this webinar. A previous ACS webinar on the 26th of September last year looked in detail at the forthcoming legislation and why and how you should act. It included many cybersecurity breach stories that have been publicly reported. So I'm not going to go through all the threats and stories in this webinar. They were well reported so far by the last webinar by John Hughes. So you can find this link and listen to this for that sort of information. Earlier in the year as well, Nick Tate and myself did a webinar on cybersecurity is not optional, and a deep analysis of the ACS cybersecurity report. That's the report produced by the Australian Computer Society in November 2016. We looked at this, and again, this webinar is available for members to look at and recap what was said then. Now, some of the questions that were raised by these earlier webinars and discussions we've been having since was, well, yes, we know about this, but really it's only going to apply to the big end of town. A lot of entities, and by entity we mean it's a general term used by the government to mean an agency or an organisation or a charity or anyone that this could apply to. So any state entities, universities, small businesses are exempt and not covered anyway. It's only going to apply to serious breaches involving large number of records. It won't matter, it's not applying to my IP, only personal information. And really, a lot of the risks are cloud, mobile, third-party entities. And they're the ones who are going to be responsible. Well, is this true? The answer to the question is yes, possibly, sometimes, and no. But in other words, it's not simple. Unfortunately, there's not a simple answer to any of these questions. And what is really important is not used as an excuse that it doesn't apply to me because I'm too small, or my data is outside Australia, or it's a third-party responsibility. If you believe this to be the case, you really must do something like a threshold assessment to be sure if it applies to you or not. I'll certainly cover these points. Either way, you should consider the fact that the breach notification law is asking you, in fact, to do something which is simply good business sense. So even if you're outside of Australia, like our South Pacific colleagues, who some of who are tuning into this, I just want to reinforce that this is a good business practice, and perhaps we should be doing it anyway, regardless of whether it applies to you under the current legislation in Australia. So is it not my problem? Well, let's have a look at that issue. What we're talking about is this notifiable data breach scheme. And it's a requirement to anyone who has to comply with the Commonwealth Privacy Act 1988 and its many modifications since, to report on and act on serious data breaches. The report is done to the federal government by the Office of the Australian Information Commission, or OAIC for short. And the Act refers to the requirement to inform individuals who've been affected by a breach. Now, in this webinar, I will address some pertinent key questions. Firstly, does this apply to you? Are there exemptions? Do all breaches need reporting? Do you have to let the individuals who have been affected know? How and when do you notify the government? How can you tell if you've been breached? And what action should you be taking to minimise such risks? Well, there is a legislative patchwork when it comes to the Privacy Act. When we look at the Commonwealth, the large businesses and small businesses, we've also got to consider state and territory governments. Now, the Privacy Act will cover the Commonwealth and the large and medium-sized businesses, and some, but not all, small businesses. It doesn't cover the state and territories, but that might only apply to things like private hospitals and, public hospitals and public schools. And many of the other areas in, say, for example, health, the doctors, the pharmacies, and so forth, are going to be covered as private entities, not public. We'll also find that there's a number of, where there are privacy acts for the state, that isn't universal, and we do have information privacy acts as well, which, we also have freedom of information acts as well, which cover the some states and some Commonwealth entities. Now, when it comes to the small business entities, yes, there is, we'll look at in a minute the requirement here in the exemptions. But for example, all healthcare providers are covered by the Act, but small IT businesses may not be. So it's likely they'll be covered by contract to ensure that there is some cover necessary for the healthcare providers who are going to be responsible for that personal information. And then when we come to the universities, ANU and Bond are covered by the Privacy Act, but the public universities are not. But then all the private private education suppliers will be covered by it. So what we end up with is quite a patchwork. And there are exemptions. So does it only relate to the big end of town? Well, small businesses are exempt if they've got a turnover of less than 3 million a year. But note, this is a turnover, not a profit. So, and that's income from all sources. And there are a number of times these exemptions won't apply. Health service providers, people trading in personal information, anyone having to report on anti-money laundering, and so forth. There's a long list here. Now, the very last point here, in blue, businesses that have opted in to be covered by the Privacy Act, is very pertinent. I actually opt to have my business covered by the Privacy Act to ensure my clients know that I will be acting professionally with their data. So you can volunteer to be covered. If my client is a larger business and it's not exempt for the bullet points given above, then they are, if they're sensible, they want to ensure they're covered by the clauses that state I will comply with the privacy policy in their contracts or service agreements. You don't really have to be that large. I mean, anyone with 20, say, professional employees, a rough guideline as to when it will kick in. So you may not have to comply, but should you? If you do comply, you're not going to be slugged with regular reporting regulations. It does mean you need a privacy policy and some company policies on the use and protection of personal information. And I'll expand on that a little bit later. But why just personal data? Do you not have to report all breaches? Well, let's consider this. The data breach notification scheme is an addition to the Privacy Act. And the Privacy Act applies to any information or an opinion whether it's true or not, that relates to an individual. To be more precise, can an individual be reasonably identified from the information you hold? Well, there's two issues here. What is reasonable, and how will they be identified? So at one end of the spectrum, consider a record with name, address, date of birth, plus some other information. Say a registered company with your business. Clearly, if that information is stored in plain text, someone can be readily identified. What about a car registration plate or a Medicare number? Well, here's where the reasonable bit kicks in. The only people who've got access to appropriate government databases can link numbers such as car registration to people and Medicare to people. So you could say it's not reasonable that is a way of identifying someone. Whereas a photograph of someone is a reasonable way of identifying them. So numbers like your Medicare, the new individual health identifier that's used these days with My Health Record, these are protected by law. So private businesses should not be keeping these anyway, unnecessarily. It has to relate to the individual who could be identified from the information you hold. Note though, it's not necessary to have their name in the information or their photograph, but if the individual can be reasonably identified by linking it to other readily available information, then it's also considered stuff you need to protect, information you need to protect. So we're dealing with personal information, and such information in the wrong hands has a potential to harm that person. Well, this picture here is, I don't know if you've ever heard of Wound Man, but that was something from many centuries ago that showed all the ways that someone could be injured. And this is the modern version. And this is not the sort of harm that we're looking at with cybersecurity, but we could be considering certainly psychological harm. We could be considering harm that's a result of medications, that having the wrong medications or medication management being affected. It's more likely to be financial harm, where criminal hackers are focused on their own financial advantage. But it could result in just an embarrassment, enough for the person to want nothing else but an apology. That could be considered if it's a serious offence. We'll look at that. So to recap so far, yes, the Privacy Act may not apply to you directly, but perhaps it would be good if it did. The data breach notification scheme applies to personal data from which an individual can be reasonably identified. You may, as a result of a breach, have to report to the Office of the Australian Information Commission. You may need to inform the individuals who have been affected by your breach. So what is considered a breach and what sort of breaches need to be notified? The OISC says the laws applies to a serious breach. Now that isn't just in terms of numbers, it could be, but it's in terms of what impact it's likely to have on the people involved. The OISC also gives a number of steps it should take, and there's a flowchart that you can find from the OISC website. I'll look at this in a little bit more detail in a minute. But the initial step is to ensure that everyone has got good governance and good security. But this is already a legal requirement for personally identifiable information. This is already covered by the Privacy Act. So you should have good governance and good security already. It's just what happens when that lets you down. Now what you'll find if you go to the OISC website is that there are a number of guides available. I think I just skipped through those. Let me, a data breach notification guide. This one's was in need of updating. It's 2014. There is a identify eligible data breaches guideline, assessing a suspect data breach, how to tell whether how to assess a breach. There is a guide on notifying individuals, how to go about it. and a guide to developing a data breach response plan. But these collection, as of, I discovered yesterday, there is a new guide that's been brought out, and I haven't had a chance to go through this yet. I've only had a chance to look at the overview of it, and it would appear to cover many of those issues that are covered there. So the point to make is that go to the OIC website and oic.gov.au and find this information, and you'll find it's very readable and it's very understandable, and it tells you what you need to know. So the first step, yes, we've got good governance and security. We think we might have a data breach. The first thing we must do is try and contain that to prevent that spreading, and then do an assessment on what is this data breach? Is it going to be a serious data breach? And investigate what has occurred. So on this issue of types of data breach, well, we've got some which have got sensitive information, like a person's health record. Other sensitive information. Sensitive information is defined well in the Act. It's about health information. It's about people's political views, whether they're members of trade unions, whether they've got a criminal record, and so forth. So they're quite specific as what sensitive information is. Any breach of sensitive information is likely to be considered a serious breach. Then we've got other information which could be used for identity fraud. And then there's financial information, your credit card numbers and so forth. Or we might have a combination of different types of personal information that allows us to know a lot about an individual. So these are types of personal information. And if we're going to assess the risk of serious harm, the recommendation is that we do this holistically. I've given other presentations on what it means to do a holistic analysis, where we take into consideration not just security, but privacy, trust, confidentiality, safety, and we look at the full picture to determine how that may affect and harm people and what the implications are. So with regard to data breach, you know, they do give on the OIC website a non-exhaustive list of relevant matters, but it's a matter of interpretation. They can't cover everything. You've got to look at it and decide what impact that's going to have. So how are you going to do that? So how are you going to determine the impact? Well, what you're going to have to do is, you know, look at the likelihood of this happening. How much, what's the probability of harm occurring and the nature of that harm? Well, first of all, the nature of the harm. In the past, I've decided to break this down into 3 types of harm that can happen with a system that lets us down for a security or privacy breach. Harm to the individual, harm to the system, or even harm to the environment. Now, specifically under this Act, we're looking at harm to the individual, where you might hurt someone's feelings, you might harm their health, which is physical or psychological, you might harm their personal finances. And this is the main emphasis. Of course, there are other harms that can occur. The system can be harmed and harm the IT system itself. Data's deleted, things could be destroyed if it's Internet of Things and so forth. We know that security breaches can cause all sorts of harm. That in itself may directly or indirectly cause harm to the individual. So that's why you have to think of it holistically. And then the one that isn't thought about so much, we might harm the environment. And here we're looking at the wider environment, not just the physical environment, but the community and what impact that could have from loss of trust and so forth. So that's looking at types of harm. How are we going to determine really what the impact is? That has to be done through risk assessment. A risk assessment requires detailed analysis. We need to look at each risk. This is a classic risk of not updating software to the latest versions. a common thing. It's going to be covered under APP 11 of the Australian Privacy Principles, what you may do to mitigate against that, and what recommendations should come from this. And of course, we have to consider the severity. And the severity on a risk mapping is the likelihood against consequences. So if the consequence is high because it involves a large number of people or serious harm could happen to them, then it's likely to be a high or very high risk. But if, you know, on the other end of the scale, the consequence is insignificant and the chance of it happening is very remote, then it's a very low risk, and we may not actually need to take any action except just monitor and keep an eye on what's occurring. And of course, then we need to manage those risks and decide how we're going to deal with them. So risk management is an important part of this assessment that's going on. How do we do all this with personal information? Well, the answer is a privacy impact assessment. And the guidelines for privacy impact assessment, again, published by the government and the UK government and the US government. Every major Western country has their own version. There's a European one as well, looking at how to do a privacy impact assessment as a method to determine the severity of these risks, what should be done to minimize them, and so forth. So that helps us identify the risks that we've got, and helps us, and from that, we should be determining what security measures should be put in place to minimize them. But then a breach comes along. No matter what we do, no matter how hard we try to prevent these things occurring, no matter how much we reduce the risks, there are, criminals out there, there are malicious people out there, and they're working, and there's states, nations out there fighting against us. So it's likely no matter what you do, we've still got to be aware that a breach can occur. How are we going to know we've been breached? And what should we do to detect that this has occurred? There are some general guidelines given by the OISC, but it's important within your organization you take that many steps further than just thinking about what's occurring. There needs to be, as shown here, a number of steps in place that determine that you've got, you know, a data breach is likely to occur, could occur, and what you're doing to minimize the possibility of the impact of that when it does. So how do we know if we've got a breach? Well, certainly you should deploy modern data breach detection tools. And this is not just your malware and so forth. Obviously, you know, firewalls and other things need to be in place, but it's more than that. I mean, you certainly need tools that are going to show up irregular behavior and help you determine that things are not as they should be. You certainly need to stay up to date with cybercrime evolution. You understand the motivations behind people. Quite often when I talk to people in the health industry, you know, they're focused on the protection of maybe medical information without the realization that a lot of the criminal hackers are interested in it for other reasons, okay, as there could be a soft target for identity theft. And so it's not necessarily the information that they're trying to protect that they're motivated towards. So hackers are relentless and continuously employ new means to penetrate networks. And studies show that malware authors create about 5 new malware programs every second. And last year's prevention method won't hold up to this year's attacks. So you certainly need to be up to date. Leveraging global threat intelligence. No one can successfully defeat today's cybercrime by themselves. By leveraging threat intelligence generated by other organizations around the world, like SANS, for example, you have a huge advantage in knowing what it is you should be doing to stay on top. Performing real-time monitoring of all major portions of the enterprise. To be more efficient, detect and investigate security incidents. Your analysts need to comprehensively and immediately visible to key indicators of compromise. They must need to know straight away that things are occurring. Monitor attack campaigns, not just individual alerts. The problem with conventional malware detection products is that they only give you a visible point in time threat. They might say, oh, we've identified something, but often an attack will happen in multiple stages, and it's built up over time. So it's a case of making sure that you see that something is evolving, rather than, oh, I've had an individual. That could be part of a sustained attack that's been built up over time, and this is quite often the methods that are used. Certainly get the right cybersecurity expertise, and I mentioned already there is a shortage, but there are other things you can think about. I mean, a lot of people will look for the universities to partner with, for example, to get some ideas and get some people who can help them, who've got a good idea on the latest problems. And ongoing training. Now, that can't be emphasized enough. And I've got a few, on the next slide, I'm going to show you a few things about conditions that enterprises can teach our administrators and users to watch for to see whether breaches are occurring. So we need to stay up to date. Obviously, the security teams do, but also everybody else does. It's everybody's problem. And let's see why I'm saying this. Are you being breached? Here are a few conditions that enterprises can teach admin users to watch for. Has things slowed down? Are accounts locked out? You get pop-ups and being redirected when browsing. Possibly already you do, but is this occurring in a more than you expect? Are software installs happening? Anyone who's an expert in this will understand these and spot this straight away, but are your users looking out for these things? Are they saying, hang about, I've been asked to install software. Obviously, a company with a strong policy wouldn't allow them to be doing that. But the fact that these things are occurring, or they seem to be occurring on certain times of the day when it's not expected, or requests for large amounts or objects to be downloaded, these are all, some of the things to think about in part of your training. And this list is not exhaustive, and it's going to be different from organization to organization, but it's something to be thinking about in terms of that user education. So we talked about quite a bit about breaches and the seriousness of the breaches and how we might detect them. So we know we've got a breach, and we either know that it's not serious. So I can give some examples in a minute of one that's not serious, where we don't have to do anything. If, for example, here's an example of one that can easily occur that's not serious. You've sent a database of customer records to someone in your organization or someone outside your organization. You attached the wrong file. You sent private information out. But it only went to one person. And that person is a professional. They're an ACS certified professional. They follow a moral code of conduct. You contact them immediately. You say, please delete that. I've sent you the wrong thing. Can you make sure it's deleted from your don't keep a copy of it. And they come back immediately and say, understood, these things happen. I've removed all copies of it. Be assured there's no concern. That puts you outside the seriousness, okay? Obviously your organization needs to do something, but that isn't necessarily something that has to be reported to the federal government, all right? Because of the sort of action that was taken and because of how it occurred. Now, it would be different, of course, if that had been up, that same file had been up on your website and you discovered it's been there for 9 months, then you've got a different problem, okay? So there's lots of examples of what action should be needed to be taken and examples of data breach, again, on the website. And I encourage people to go and read those because they're a very good way of understanding what happens. Here's another example. An employee leaves a smartphone on public transport while on their way to work. when the employee arrives at work, they realise the smartphone has been lost and ask the employer's IT support staff to remotely delete the information on the smartphone. Because the security measures on the smartphone, the IT support staff are confident that its contents could not have been accessed in the short period between when it was lost and when its contents were deleted. Okay, now if that phone obviously had no login at all, didn't use a fingerprint, didn't use a pattern, didn't use a password, then of course the risk is higher. If the information was secured in some way or even encrypted and it'd been acted on quickly and deleted remotely, the chances are it's not going to be a serious risk. Okay, so it depends. It has to be analysed in each case. So there's just a couple of examples. I invite you to read to look at more. But if you have got a serious harm, what are you going to do? Well, by law, there are three options you must take. One is notify all the individuals. Two, notify that all the individuals, perhaps in your customer database, that we've had a breach, this is what we're doing, this is how we're dealing with it, you have a right to know, and we're letting you know. You don't have to tell them all. If you decide that you know who's been breached and who hasn't, then you can tell just those individuals concerned. That's option two. There are going to be cases like I said, somebody's been on the website, you don't know, you haven't got any record of anyone uploading it, you can't find, there's no audit of anything occurring, but there's still a risk. You may decide then, well, we'll just publish a statement on our website that we've had this breach and how we're dealing with it and so forth. And that's sort of the requirement that is expected now to deal with that scenario. So when it comes to the actual reporting, if you go to the website now, you'll find that this page has actually been brought down. I think it's going to be live tomorrow of how to fill in the data breach notification. And then what do I tell the individuals concerned? There are guidelines on that, as I say. So that gives you a much clearer idea on how to approach the problem. I've also advised you to have a look at, I mentioned privacy impact assessments. Well, I have some free guidelines on my website on how to do a privacy risk analysis and what should be in a privacy policy and how to look at cloud risk and analyze that for privacy and security concerns. And there's lots of checklists and so forth in there, which I think you might feel you may find useful. So I just point that out. Helpmeprivacy.com is the easy way to get there. So what's the way forward? What should we do, understanding what I've told you so far? Well, firstly, you should ensure your organization is privacy compliant. That should be happening anyway. But think about what I've been saying. Is it? And should you need to look at things a little bit further? Do become familiar with the OIC website and their practical guidelines. There's a lot of resources there. In very easy to understand format that takes you through the steps that you need to think about. Do a privacy impact assessment, particularly with new projects, to see where those risks are, because quite often you can reduce those risks significantly by taking steps which may not be obvious until you've done an impact assessment. When you realize that this is a high risk, you say, I'm sorry, but it will have to be encrypted. And we will have to look after, only certain people will be able to look after the keys. And that way we can be sure it's unreasonable for someone to decrypt that information and find out the personal information that's on it. As an example, there's lots of examples, but it gives you that sort of, gives you the, assurance that you've thought about things, about where all the data goes, where the backup is, where the copies are made. Are people using things like Dropbox and so forth to pass around sensitive information? All those sort of problems which are typical of the problems that occur and cause problems down the track. Follow a privacy by design approach. What that means is don't think about privacy as something you bolt on afterwards. Whenever you design your new product, think about privacy up front. as we do now with security. Okay, no one thinks about bringing out new products without security in mind. They did originally. We're using a lot of that software still. No names mentioned, but you all know who it is. But, you know, bolting things on afterwards is not the best approach. Think about it right up front. Stay on top of cyber threats and monitor all potential breach activity. Don't wait till things happen. Stable door approach is not the answer. It's not going to get you out of trouble. Do report serious breaches and act promptly to prevent them reoccurring. People who think that companies, large organizations, have tried to hide things under the carpet. Usually, well, we now know they were trying to hide things under the carpet because we're now aware of it. Some of them may have got away with it, right? Some of them don't. And when they don't, it causes serious problems to their bottom line. It causes them a lot of financial headache, much more so than if they acted up front. Besides, it's a legal requirement now. And notify the individuals who've been breached. I think at the last survey I saw, 97% of people said, yes, they expected to be notified. Okay, it's not something they think, oh, we trust you. I'm sure you've sorted it out. No, they'd like to know. It's their data. It's about them. They'd like to know so they can change their credit card number. They can do something that would prevent the thing escalating. And finally, probably the most important thing in your organization, if you're not the CEO or CIO, please talk to them about it all the time and say, make sure they're aware of all the risks and their obligations, because you'll be surprised how many you don't appreciate what they really need to know. And they're hoping that the technical people have got it covered. And that's not the approach we need to be on top of these things. So thank you very much. And we'll go over to questions now. I'll just stop this show. And sorry, I haven't taken questions. We got along, but it's much easier to just get through the presentation. Okay. Do you want to read some of the questions out, Carly, so I can see?
Yeah.
That's okay. Okay. Yeah, I'll unmute my. I'm muted. I'm not muted at the moment. No.
Okay. Thanks, Peter. That was great. We've got a couple of questions that have come in. One from Margaret Turner. Margaret, thanks for coming in. It's great to see you on here. Now, Margaret has asked, we're going to answer this slide. Margaret says, I'm in Queensland Government and we've been told it applies to us only when the data has stored tax file numbers. Is that true? And now I'll mute.
I don't know the answer. All I can say is that Queensland Government is not covered by the Privacy Act if you know, you're working, but tax file numbers probably have a separate legislation. So the Queensland Government has its own Privacy Act, and at this moment, to my knowledge, the Queensland Government Privacy Act does not require notifiable breaches. So it's a good question. I'll have to come back to you on it. I don't know the answer off the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I have Aman here who has raised his hand. Aman, would you like to just write your question in the Q&A, please, if you can, if you're still there? And does anyone else have any more questions? I'll give a couple minutes. Oh, looks like you covered it all, Pete.
Anyway, I'll just say that I'm happy if you want to email me questions. help@petercroll.com will get to me, or just contact Kylie. That's fine as well. Contact anyone that within the ACS office. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to answer them offline, and we'll have a conversation if that's helpful.
I'm going to. That's great. Thanks, Peter. So Peter just said, if reiterating what Peter just said, if you have anything that you would like to ask him, you can contact him by his LinkedIn, by me. And also, this will be uploaded onto our YouTube, ACS Queensland YouTube channel. So that can be accessed at any time for you if you want to review this. Once again, thank you all for coming. And this is another question here. I'll just check. Hold on a minute. One sec. Okay, there's one more coming. Just writing.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Don't worry about the spelling, just type.
Yeah, we'll decipher it. Just a reminder too that ACS do have our certified cybersecurity professional certification offer at the moment. So Peter just did that, as he said at the beginning, and we've got a fair few Queensland members who have come on and done that, and it's very worthwhile to do if you're working in the cybersecurity space.
So I'll just let people know a little bit about that process. You need to be a certified professional already. So a certified professional bracket cybersecurity is an addition to being a certified professional. So if you're already you either need to apply to be a certified professional, and then you can apply also to be a certified professional in cybersecurity. If you're already a certified professional, you just need to apply to be graded on the cybersecurity. And the process is to hand in some documentation that shows what you've done and demonstrates your skills. Not you know, it's not just experience. I mean, this is based on like Sapphire levels. You know, showing that you're working at level 5, 6, and 7 as Sapphire. If you're familiar with that, hopefully all our ACS members are. If you're working for a certified professional. There's also the certified technician, which is slightly lower requirement in terms of Sapphire levels, but again, a worthwhile qualification to pursue. Having submitted your application and with a couple of referees who actually know your work well, then the process will kick off. And I think mine took about 5 weeks in total. But then there was some delays for my referees, so it probably could have been quicker if I'd give it. It's my fault actually. I gave the wrong email addresses, but yeah.
Okay, I have another question for you.
Excellent.
Okay, another question. Do we still need to notify both the Australian federal government and the individuals if we have taken reasonable steps to mitigate the damage?
If the reasonable steps you've taken has prevented a serious breach, then no, you don't have to notify. If reasonable, even if because you've taken reasonable steps, doesn't mean that you don't have to notify. Yes, you still have to let them know and let the individuals know what occurred. It's an expectation that you do take reasonable steps to mitigate as soon as you can. But if, as a process, if you go through the guidelines, it makes it quite clear that if you've managed to limit the damage so that it's not serious, then you don't need to make a notification. Okay? If you've had a serious breach, even if you've mitigated it, yes, you will have to notify them. That's my understanding of the way the guidelines are presented.
We've got another one here from Divyesh. Okay, hopefully I've got this right, Divyesh. If you can just text me back if I haven't got it. Can I claim back if I am breached in case of any cyber issues, even though it is not a big issue? Meaning I can say I was not aware about the breach, so I should be the victim. Not sure.
You have to act as soon as you are aware. Okay, and if that is because somebody else has told you, or the government's told you, you know, that's when you're required to act. saying that you didn't know about that, you're not going to be held liable because a breach occurred unless you haven't satisfied the expected security requirements under APP 11. All right, if you've taken all the reasonable steps to prevent a breach happening, but you still get breached because we're dealing with, malicious people with good resources behind them, we know that people can get breached anyway. So it's not a blame game thing, but there will be a blame game if you haven't done anything to prevent it occurring in the first place. Okay, you will need to make sure that you comply with the minimum expected security requirements, and you've taken reasonable steps to prevent that happening. You find out later that there's been, someone tells you you've been breached and you're breached, and this happens all the time. I mean, people find out months later, and they find out from other sources. It's not necessarily, but that point I made in the presentation, really, it's good, very good practice to provide yourself not in that position by doing ongoing continuous monitoring and staying aware of what can occur. So, prevent it occurring in the first place. Prevention is better. It's always better if you can prevent it. It may be you can't prevent it, but as long as you've followed best working practice, they're not going to turn around and fine you and say, you've been breached and you shouldn't have. It's not a case of being fined for being breached. It's a case of being fined for not doing the right thing. And we've done all the right things, and we've seen this happen in the past. If you look back at the OIC website, there's lots of case history. And in some cases, they'll say the organizations did all the right things. Okay. Oh, one thing I didn't mention, which I just thought about, I did mention at the beginning, but I didn't talk about, was you can't pass the responsibility on. This has happened before with two organizations where the IT people didn't keep the database secure by keeping their updates going through. The organization that held the personal data said it was the IT company's fault. Well, they still had to take the blame. It's not their fault. The IT company said we were just told because we were told. So you can't pass on your responsibility. If it happens in the cloud, if it happens on the mobile devices, you might be able to sue that company, but you're still going to be under the law of the Privacy Act, the responsible party.
Interesting. Okay. See if we've got any more questions. I think I've just seen one come in. Okay, last one. Is there any real-time example these days which is very common for cyber breach?
Real-time example?
Do you mean by... Okay, you need to...
I don't quite understand the question, but is there a more common cyber breach than others? Is what we're saying there.
Can you just expand on that question, please? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to type that in.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of people who would say that the human error and the social engineering is one of the highest risks areas. And it will be, I think the thing is that things are shifting all the time. It's a moving target. I can make a claim today what the highest risk is, and then tomorrow it moves on. And that comes back to what I was saying, the awareness, the global awareness of what's happening. If you looked at SANS Institute of top 10 risks, things that you should do, you'll find that continuously changing. Okay, because the adversaries get aware of certain, new techniques and new methods, and so and new vulnerabilities are becoming evident all the time. So obviously, vulnerabilities we are aware of are the ones that we should fix, and trying to stay ahead as much as we can of ones that are coming up. See, sometimes things are reported, and then the operating system or the application manufacturers haven't got a fix for it yet.
Okay.
So that's when you've got 100 still exposed.
Okay, so this is in addition to what Debyesh.
Sure, yeah.
What it means is any example which is
suitable for this webinar. For example, someone who was breached and wasn't aware. I just need what sort of breach, an example of that.
Okay, let me have, there are lots of examples, as I said, on the OAC website. But an example of someone who's breached not aware. Now, I looked up, I can't remember which organisation it was. On the way in this morning, I looked up 17 top cybersecurity breaches. As a website you can look up. So if you Google it, you'll find out that, and of those, I think there was about 5 where they weren't previously aware that they'd been breached, and a long time had passed before it happened. So you don't have to go very far to search to find that information. I don't want to name any particular company, but you know, it's a common occurrence.
Okay, there's one more. Okay, I might just make this last question from Dean. I assume, let's just do that. I assume all these guidelines apply to any data breach, not just a cyber breach. For example, some printed information is stolen.
Yeah.
So security is also important.
Certainly. When you do a privacy impact assessment, you don't look at just the electronic version of the data. You might be concerned about, I mean, it might come in electronic, like a fax, and it gets printed. But the printed information has to be secured as well. So the Privacy Act is actually what they call technology neutral. It doesn't actually say it's about electronic information. So it refers to information, and that information can be in written form, and it can even be something spoken. You know, it can be an opinion. So it doesn't have to necessarily be on the computer, but that's the one obviously we're focused on mainly. But when you do a privacy impact assessment, you do need to look at the whole thing, because there have been lots of occurrences of data breaches that have occurred, particularly with medical records. For example, a general practitioner passes on, he runs a small business, and they just dump all his files in the skip. Now, this has happened in practice. Okay, so you know, no one knew what to do with all these medical records, so they just threw them out. They didn't get properly shredded because there was no one actually running that business anymore. So there's an example of a breach that actually happened, and you know, things have been found in sheds and all sorts of things. I think didn't the government have this as well recently with the all their top secret stuff in filing cabinets?
Yes.
So yeah. It's something you need to think. It's something you think about when you do a privacy impact assessment. You do a information mapping, and that information mapping shows where the information goes, and where, you know, it could start on paper, it could be scanned in, it could be electronic, it could be printed off again. It doesn't matter. You're following that information around.
Thanks, Pete. Okay, we might just leave it there. We've got no more questions that have come in. So thanks everyone for coming in today. And thanks again, Peter, for your time. He's always doing stuff for us. He's amazing. All the best, everyone. If you have any more questions, please send them through to either me, Pete. Hang on, there's one more. Oh, Devesh says thanks.
That's a good question. I like that question. Thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed your lunch. If not, go have some lunch, and I'll see you at the next one. Thanks. Bye.
Goodbye, everyone.